In a high-stakes hospital setting, tensions between a racist surgeon and a black nurse escalate during a critical moment, with unexpected consequences that leave lasting ripples. What unfolds next is a powerful story of humility, respect, and transformation in the face of adversity. If you're ready for an unforgettable journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe before we dive into the full story. It was a typical Monday morning at St. Augustine Hospital. The hospital bustled with the sounds of nurses' shoes squeaking against the tiled floors, carts being wheeled through hallways, and the occasional beeping of machines that monitored patients' vital signs. Dr. Richard Harper, the head of surgery, walked briskly toward the operating theater, his white coat flowing behind him. He was an experienced surgeon, renowned in his field, and someone who commanded respect wherever he went. Dr. Harper, however, was also known for his arrogance, particularly toward the nursing staff. Angela Wilson, a black nurse with more than 10 years of experience in the field, stood outside the operating theater preparing for the day's surgeries. Angela was a competent, level-headed nurse who had seen it all during her years of working in high-pressure situations. Despite her expertise, she was often dismissed by Dr. Harper, who rarely listened to her input during surgeries. As she adjusted the instruments, Angela noticed that today wasn't like every other day. She overheard whispers that the hospital's board of directors, along with several high-profile donors, would be observing the surgery. Her stomach tightened slightly, but she remained composed. Dr. Harper entered the operating theater, immediately surveying the room. He barely acknowledged Angela as he focused on preparing for the surgery. In his mind, he was the star of the show, the surgeon whose hands could save lives. He wasn't concerned with the contributions of others, especially not from nurses, who he viewed as merely assistants, there to carry out his orders without question. He checked his wristwatch. The high-profile visitors, including the hospital's chief executive officer, Mr. Maxwell, and a couple of prominent donors, were expected to arrive any moment. Angela noticed the tension in Dr. Harper's movements. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was anxious. Whenever he felt the pressure, he tended to take out his frustrations on the staff, and she braced herself for what might come. As the first patient was wheeled in, Angela reviewed the patient's chart once again. It was a delicate operation involving an older man who had suffered from multiple complications. She quietly suggested a minor adjustment to the anesthesia dosage, knowing that the patient's pre-existing conditions might affect the surgery. But Dr. Harper shot her a cold glance. "Nurse Wilson, I don't need your input on this. Just do your job and leave the medical decisions to the professionals," he snapped, his voice loud enough for the others in the room to hear. Angela felt her cheeks flush with humiliation, but she kept her composure. She was used to Dr. Harper's arrogance, but his words stung more today, especially with so many eyes on them. The surgical team glanced at her sympathetically, but no one dared to speak up. Angela busied herself with preparing the instruments, trying to shake off the embarrassment. She was a seasoned nurse, and she knew that focusing on the patient was her top priority, no matter how much Dr. Harper undermined her. Moments later, the high-profile visitors entered the observation room overlooking the operating theater. The hospital's CEO, Mr. Maxwell, nodded to Dr. Harper through the glass, and the donors, a wealthy couple who had contributed millions to the hospital's new wing, took their seats. Dr. Harper straightened up, his entire demeanor changing as he prepared to show off his skills. The air in the room felt thick with tension as the surgery began. Angela watched the monitors carefully, her instincts telling her to stay vigilant despite Dr. Harper's dismissal of her earlier concern. As the surgery progressed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. As the surgery progressed, the tension in the operating room grew palpable. Dr. Harper's steady hands moved swiftly, his focus solely on impressing the high-profile visitors in the observation room. Angela stood by, monitoring the patient's vitals, her eyes trained on the heart rate monitor. Everything seemed to be progressing smoothly at first, but as they moved further into the operation, Angela noticed the patient's blood pressure starting to drop. She knew this could be dangerous, especially given the patient's medical history. Angela quickly spoke up, her voice firm but respectful. "Doctor, the patient's blood pressure is falling. We need to adjust the dosage of the anesthesia. Dr. Harper barely looked up from his work. I'm well aware of the vitals, Nurse Wilson. Kindly keep your comments to yourself unless asked. He snapped again, his irritation evident. Angela clenched her jaw in frustration, knowing she was right but unwilling to cause a scene in front of the visitors. Dr. Harper, driven by his desire to appear infallible, continued the surgery without acknowledging Angela's warning. In his mind, he was the expert in the room, and nothing could go wrong under his watch, certainly not while the hospital's most important donors were observing. The visitors, sitting behind the glass, watched intently as the surgery unfolded. Mr. Death Maxwell smiled approvingly, clearly confident in Dr. Harper's abilities. Angela, however, remained on edge. She couldn't ignore the increasingly erratic numbers flashing on the monitor. The patient's blood pressure continued to drop, and now the heart rate was becoming irregular. Doctor, Angela said again, this time more urgently, the vitals are unstable. We need to intervene now. Dr. Harper finally looked up, glaring at her with impatience. I don't need a nurse telling me how to handle my surgeries, he barked. The room fell silent, the other medical staff exchanging nervous glances, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. Suddenly, a sharp alarm pierced through the room. The heart rate monitor showed a dangerous drop, and the patient's body began to show signs of distress. Panic set in as the realization hit everyone in the room. The patient was crashing. Dr. Harper froze for a moment, his hands hovering above the patient, unsure of what to do next. The high-profile visitors looked on in shock, realizing that something had gone terribly wrong. Angela didn't hesitate. She immediately sprang into action, her years of experience kicking in. We need to stabilize the patient now. She called out to the team, taking charge of the situation. She adjusted the anesthesia levels as she had suggested earlier, administering the necessary treatment to counteract the drop in blood pressure. The other nurses and medical staff followed her lead, moving quickly to assist in saving the patient. Dr. Harper, still stunned by the sudden turn of events, was forced to step back and watch as Angela took control of the room. With precision and speed, Angela directed the team through the emergency. She remained calm under pressure, working methodically to bring the patient's vitals back to a stable state. The heart rate monitor slowly began to steady, and the blood pressure inched back into a safer range. The entire operating room staff moved in unison, following Angela's clear instructions, while Dr. Harper stood by, silent and stunned. After several tense minutes, the crisis had passed. The patient was no longer in immediate danger, thanks to Angela's quick thinking and expert handling of the situation. She let out a small breath of relief, though her expression remained professional. The visitors, who had been holding their breath during the ordeal, slowly relaxed as they saw the situation come under control. Mr. Maxwell exchanged a look with the donors, who seemed both impressed and relieved, though it was clear that Dr. Harper had lost the confidence of everyone in the room. Dr. Harper, his pride shattered, could barely bring himself to speak. His usual arrogance had been stripped away in front of the very people he had hoped to impress. For the first time in his career, he had been forced to rely on the very nurse he had spent years belittling. The shame he felt was suffocating, especially knowing that Angela had not only saved the patient's life, but had done so in front of the hospital's most powerful visitors. Angela, however, didn't gloat or bask in her victory. She finished her work, ensuring the patient was stable before quietly stepping back to allow the rest of the team to take over. As she cleaned up, she could feel Dr. Harper's eyes on her, though he said nothing. The rest of the team moved awkwardly around him, sensing the tension and embarrassment that now hung in the air. The once confident and commanding surgeon had been humbled in a way that no one had expected. As the surgery concluded, the high-profile visitors left the observation room, their expressions a mixture of shock and gratitude. Mr. Maxwell, the CEO, walked into the operating theater to speak with Dr. Harper, his face serious. "I'm glad the patient pulled through," Mr. Maxwell said, glancing at Angela before turning back to the doctor. "But it's clear that things didn't go as smoothly as we had hoped." Dr. Harper nodded, his face pale. He knew what was coming, and there was no way to hide from the fact that his own arrogance had nearly cost a life. Before leaving, Mr. Maxwell turned to Angela and gave her a respectful nod. "Thank you for your quick thinking, Nurse Wilson. Your actions saved that patient's life today." The donors, who had been watching closely, followed suit, offering their thanks to Angela rather than Dr. Harper. The public praise, combined with the visitors' clear disapproval of his leadership, was a devastating blow to the once proud surgeon. Dr. Harper stood there, defeated, while Angela, ever professional, simply thanked them and continued her duties. The operating room was quiet once the visitors left. The tension lingered in the air as the surgical team cleaned up and prepared for the next patient. Dr. Harper, once a symbol of confidence and authority, now looked smaller than ever. His head hung low as he reviewed what had happened. His hands, which had once been praised for their skill, now seemed inadequate in comparison to Angela's quick judgment and steady leadership. Angela moved around the room, maintaining her professionalism despite the heavy silence. She had saved the patient, and that was what mattered most to her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of pride at having proven her worth in such a high-stakes moment. As she gathered the instruments, she overheard whispers from her colleagues, words of admiration for her handling of the situation, and quiet murmurs of criticism directed toward Dr. Harper. For once, the spotlight had shifted, and it was clear to everyone who the true leader in the room had been. The silence between Angela and Dr. Harper grew heavier with each passing hour. After the surgery, Dr. Harper returned to his office without speaking another word to the surgical team. His pride had taken a hard hit, and he was struggling to process the embarrassment of being overshadowed by a nurse, particularly in front of such important visitors. For someone like Dr. Harper, whose identity was wrapped up in his image as an unshakable surgeon, this incident was more than just a professional blunder. It was a personal humiliation. Angela, on the other hand, remained focused. While the aftermath of the surgery was a topic of quiet gossip among the staff, she didn't let it distract her from her work. She moved through the day as she always did, composed, efficient, and prepared. Yet, even as she maintained her professionalism, Angela couldn't ignore the subtle shift in how her colleagues treated her. There were more nods of respect, more recognition in their eyes. Even the junior doctors seemed to look at her differently. But the one person whose opinion truly mattered, the one who had humiliated her in front of everyone, remained silent. By the end of the day, Angela was called into a meeting with Mr. Maxwell, the hospital's CEO. Her heart raced slightly as she made her way to his office, wondering what this could mean. Had she overstepped her bounds by taking control in the operating room? Was Dr. Harper already trying to blame her for the incident? She couldn't be sure. As she entered the room, Mr. Maxwell greeted her with a warm, respectful smile. The room, though formal, had an air of calm about it, easing Angela's nerves slightly. "Please, take a seat, Nurse Wilson," Mr. Maxwell said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Angela sat down, still unsure of what to expect. "I just wanted to take a moment to commend you for your incredible work today," he began, his voice sincere. "What you did in that operating room saved a life, and that's not something that should go unnoticed." Angela nodded, grateful for the acknowledgement but unsure of where this conversation was heading. Mr. Maxwell leaned forward slightly, his expression more serious. "I've been hearing things about Dr. Harper's treatment of the staff, and today was eye-opening. He may be a talented surgeon, but there are things that need to be addressed." Meanwhile, Dr. Harper sat in his office, replaying the events of the day in his mind. His phone rang, an internal call. Reluctantly, he picked it up and recognized the voice of Mr. Maxwell's assistant, summoning him to the CEO's office. Dr. Harper's stomach churned. He knew this meeting wasn't going to be a congratulatory one. With a deep breath, he straightened his white coat and headed down the hall. When Dr. Harper arrived at Mr. Maxwell's office, he was greeted with a professional yet stern look from the CEO. "Richard, we need to talk," Mr. Maxwell began, skipping pleasantries. "What happened in that operating room today cannot happen again." Dr. Harper opened his mouth to defend himself, but Mr. Maxwell held up a hand to stop him. "I understand that surgeries are stressful, but dismissing your staff, especially someone as experienced as Nurse Wilson, was not only unprofessional, it was dangerous. She gave you vital information, and you ignored her." Dr. Harper shifted uncomfortably in his chair. feeling the sting of those words. Mr. Maxwell didn't stop there. The donors, the board, they all saw what happened. But more importantly, Angela Wilson saved that patient, not you. You should be thanking her for keeping the situation from becoming a tragedy. Dr. Harper, normally so sure of himself, was left speechless. The words that might have once rolled easily off his tongue now seemed lodged in his throat. He realized that his arrogance had led him to this point, and the regret he felt was undeniable. Word of the incident spread through the hospital quickly. In the break room, the nursing staff discussed the day's events in hushed tones. Many of them had witnessed Dr. Harper's dismissive behavior toward nurses in the past, but this was the first time someone had openly defied him, and in front of high-profile visitors, no less. Angela's actions not only saved the patient, but also sent a message to everyone that nurses were not just assistants, they were vital to the hospital's success. Angela overheard some of these conversations, but kept her head down. She wasn't interested in becoming a topic of gossip, nor did she want the incident to fuel any kind of divide between the doctors and the nurses. Her focus remained on her job, but even as she went about her duties, she couldn't shake the weight of what had transpired. Dr. Harper's silence spoke volumes. He hadn't spoken to her since the surgery, and Angela wasn't sure if he was avoiding her or simply too ashamed to face her. The following day, Angela was in the staff lounge, taking a much-needed break after a particularly long shift. She was sipping her coffee when the door creaked open, and to her surprise, Dr. Harper walked in. His usual confident stride seemed slower, more hesitant. For a moment, Angela considered leaving the room, but something in Dr. Harper's expression stopped her. He walked over and stood near the table, clearly searching for the right words. "Angela," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I owe you an apology." Angela raised her eyebrows slightly, not expecting this from the man who had humiliated her just a day ago. "What happened in the operating room? Well, I was wrong. I shouldn't have dismissed your input. You were right, and because of you, that patient is still alive." There was a weight to his words, and Angela could tell that this wasn't easy for him. Dr. Harper had never been the type to admit his mistakes, especially not to someone he viewed as his subordinate. Angela looked at him carefully, unsure of how to respond. She had long since learned to keep her emotions in check, especially in situations like this. "Thank you for acknowledging that," she finally said, her voice measured. "It's not about being right, Dr. Harper. It's about doing what's best for the patient. That's all I was trying to do." Dr. Harper nodded, his face still tense. "I know, and I need to do better. I'm trying to work on that." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was the first time Angela had seen any vulnerability in him. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of understanding between them. After their conversation in the staff lounge, something shifted between Angela and Dr. Harper. It wasn't an immediate transformation. Dr. Harper's ego was too deeply ingrained for that. But there was a noticeable difference in how he treated her. He no longer dismissed her comments during surgeries, and although he wasn't overtly friendly, he was far more respectful of her input. The rest of the surgical team noticed the change as well, and the tension that had once defined their working relationship began to ease. Angela, though cautious, appreciated the improvement. She had never sought out a personal confrontation with Dr. Harper, nor had she desired to embarrass him in front of the hospital's elite. Her only goal was to ensure the best care for her patients. As the weeks went by, Dr. Harper continued to struggle with his internal battles, balancing his pride as a renowned surgeon with the reality that he was not infallible. For Angela, the newfound respect she received from him and the rest of the team was enough to reassure her that standing up for herself and for the patient had been the right thing to do. The change in Dr. Harper's attitude toward Angela didn't just affect the operating room. It sent ripples throughout the entire hospital. Word of what had happened during the surgery had spread far and wide. Nurses, doctors, and administrative staff alike were discussing the incident in quiet corners of the hospital. Angela, now viewed as more than just a competent nurse, became a symbol of strength and professionalism. People admired how she handled the situation with dignity and poise, even when publicly humiliated. Angela, though humbled by the newfound attention, kept her focus on her work. She hadn't asked for the spotlight and didn't enjoy the gossip swirling around her. But she couldn't deny that things felt different now. Nurses from other departments would nod to her with respect, and some junior staff members even came to her for advice. Angela made sure to stay grounded, reminding herself that her goal was the same as it had always been, to take care of her patients to the best of her ability. But deep down, she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her expertise and professionalism were finally being recognized, even by Dr. Harper. Behind the scenes, the hospital's board of directors had taken notice of the incident. Mr. Maxwell had made a full report of the surgery, highlighting the near-fatal consequences of Dr. Harper's oversight and the crucial role Angela played in saving the patient. The board, already concerned about the hospital's reputation with its high-profile donors, wasn't pleased. Dr. Harper's behavior, particularly toward the nursing staff, had been the subject of quiet complaints for years, but it had never escalated to this level. During a private meeting, the board discussed the need for changes in the hospital's culture, particularly in how the medical hierarchy functioned. "This cannot continue," one board member said sternly. "We rely on teamwork, and what happened in that operating room was a failure of leadership. We need to ensure that our nurses feel empowered to speak up without fear of being dismissed or humiliated." Mr. Maxwell, seated at the head of the table, nodded in agreement. Angela Wilson exemplified what true professionalism looks like under pressure. "It's time we acknowledge the value that nurses bring to this hospital, not just as assistants, but as critical voices in patient care." Back in the hospital, Angela continued to go about her work quietly, unaware of the discussions taking place behind closed doors. But she began to notice that people were looking to her for more than just medical advice. Her colleagues, particularly the other nurses, seemed emboldened by her actions. Angela had unknowingly become a voice for those who felt dismissed or undervalued by the hospital's hierarchy. Nurses who had once kept their concerns to themselves were now more willing to speak up, encouraged by Angela's example. One afternoon during a routine staff meeting, a young nurse named Marissa hesitated before raising her hand. "I have some concerns about the patient flow system," she began nervously, glancing around the room. "It's causing delays in treatment, and I think we should explore ways to improve communication between departments." Normally, a suggestion like this might have been brushed off by senior staff, but this time, the room fell silent as people listened. Angela nodded encouragingly at Marissa, giving her the confidence to continue. After the meeting, Marissa approached Angela, grateful for her support. "I wouldn't have spoken up if it weren't for you," she admitted. Angela smiled, realizing that her actions had sparked something much bigger than just a shift in Dr. Harper's behavior. Dr. Harper, meanwhile, was struggling to reconcile his feelings. On one hand, he couldn't ignore the fact that Angela had saved the patient and that her quick thinking had spared him from a disastrous outcome. On the other hand, his pride still stung. He had built his career on being the best, on being infallible in the operating room, and admitting that he had been wrong, even silently, was a blow to his ego. Each time he saw Angela, a pang of guilt and resentment stirred within him. As the days passed, Dr. Harper noticed that people were treating him differently as well. His colleagues weren't openly critical, but there was a subtle shift in the way they interacted with him. The same junior doctors who had once hung on his every word now seemed more cautious, more reserved. He wasn't used to being questioned, and now, even when he gave instructions, he felt the eyes of his team on him, as if they were waiting for him to make another mistake. It was a new and unsettling feeling for a man who had always been so sure of himself. A few weeks after the incident, Mr. Maxwell called a meeting with several key figures in the hospital, including Dr. Harper, Angela, and the head of nursing, Mrs. Harris. The meeting was informal, but it was clear that the agenda was serious. Mr. Maxwell began by acknowledging the events of the surgery and the resulting discussions within the hospital's leadership. "What happened that day has brought to light some issues we can no longer ignore," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Our hospital prides itself on being at the forefront of medical care, but we've allowed certain practices and hierarchies to go unchecked." Angela sat quietly, listening as Mr. Maxwell spoke. She wasn't sure why she had been invited to the meeting, but it quickly became clear. "Nurse Wilson," Mr. Maxwell said, turning his attention to her, "your actions during that surgery were exemplary, and your leadership in the operating room saved a life. We've decided that your experience and perspective could play a vital role in helping us reshape how we approach patient care, particularly in terms of collaboration between doctors and nurses." Angela was taken aback. She hadn't expected this level of recognition, let alone the opportunity to influence change at such a high level. As Mr. Maxwell laid out his proposal for a new program aimed at improving teamwork and communication between medical staff, Dr. Harper sat in silence. He listened as Mr. Maxwell praised Angela and outlined plans for a hospital-wide initiative that would encourage nurses to take on more leadership roles in patient care. The program would also involve cross-training between nurses and doctors, ensuring that both sides understood each other's roles and could collaborate more effectively. Dr. Harper felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. The idea of nurses stepping into more decision-making roles wasn't something he had ever considered necessary. In his mind, the hierarchy was clear. Doctors made the decisions, and nurses followed them. But now, as Mr. Maxwell spoke, it became evident that the hospital was moving in a different direction. Dr. Harper knew that if he didn't adapt, he risked being left behind. Still, part of him resented the idea of giving up the control he had grown so accustomed to. He glanced at Angela, who sat quietly across the table, her face composed. For the first time, he wondered if she had always seen things differently, even while he had been so blind to her insights. The opportunity presented to Angela was both exciting and daunting. She had never sought out leadership positions in the past, preferring to focus on patient care rather than hospital politics. But as she sat in the meeting, listening to Mr. Maxwell's vision for change, she realized that this was about more than just her. It was about elevating the role of nurses across the hospital, ensuring that they were respected for their expertise and contributions. After the meeting, Mrs. Harris, the head of nursing, pulled Angela aside. "This is a huge opportunity, Angela," she said, her eyes filled with pride. "You've earned this, and you deserve to have your voice heard." Angela nodded, still processing everything. She knew that accepting this role would mean stepping into the spotlight in a way she had never imagined. It would mean challenging the status quo, working alongside doctors like Dr. Harper, who had long dismissed her opinions. But it would also mean standing up for herself and for every nurse who had ever been told that their input didn't matter. Later that evening, Angela sat at home, reflecting on everything that had happened. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change was often met with resistance, and she was certain that not everyone would be happy about the new program. But Angela also knew that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make a real difference, not just for herself, but for the future of nursing at St. Augustine Hospital. She thought back to that moment in the operating room when Dr. Harper had humiliated her in front of everyone. It had been a painful experience, but in a strange way, it had also opened the door to something greater. If she could turn that moment of weakness into a position of strength, maybe she could inspire others to do the same. With a deep breath, Angela made her decision. She would accept Mr. Maxwell's offer and do everything in her power to ensure that nurses were given the respect and authority they deserved. The next morning, Angela arrived at the hospital to find the staff buzzing with news. Mr. Maxwell had sent out an official email to all departments announcing the new initiative aimed at improving teamwork between nurses and doctors. He praised Angela's leadership during the surgery and outlined the hospital's plan to implement a collaborative program that would elevate nurses into more prominent roles in patient care. The email named Angela as a key figure in this initiative, ensuring that her contributions would not go unnoticed. Angela's heart pounded as she read the message on her phone. She knew this would stir up strong reactions across the hospital. As she made her way down the corridor, she could feel eyes on her. Some glances filled with admiration, others with curiosity or even resentment. Word spread quickly, and before long, colleagues were approaching her, offering congratulations or subtle words of encouragement. But amidst the praise, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Not everyone was happy about the changes, and Angela knew that some doctors, especially Dr. Harper, might push back. Dr. Harper sat at his desk, staring at the announcement email. His initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and frustration. Angela had always been a competent nurse, but in his eyes, she had never been someone who should be leading an initiative that challenged the traditional hierarchy. The idea of nurses having a stronger voice in decision-making felt like a threat to the authority he had spent his entire career building. But as much as Dr. Harper wanted to reject the changes outright, he couldn't ignore the writing on the wall. The board had fully endorsed the program, and Mr. Maxwell's backing meant that resistance would only damage his reputation further. Dr. Harper sighed, rubbing his temples. He knew he had to tread carefully. If he opposed Angela's leadership too openly, it would make him look defensive, like a relic of an outdated system. But if he embraced the change, even reluctantly, he risked losing the control he had always valued. Torn between pride and practicality, Dr. Harper decided to take a more measured approach. He would see how things unfolded, but he wasn't going to give in without a fight. The days following the announcement were filled with tension, as Angela began to meet with various hospital departments to discuss the new initiative. Each meeting felt like a balancing act. Some doctors were open to the idea of a more collaborative approach, while others viewed it as an affront to their authority. Nurses, on the other hand, were overwhelmingly supportive. For the first time, many of them felt empowered to speak up, knowing that Angela was championing their cause. During one of the meetings, Dr. Harper sat in the back of the room, observing quietly as Angela led a discussion about improving communication between nurses and doctors in the operating room. She spoke with confidence, outlining specific changes that could prevent the kind of crisis they had experienced during the surgery. The room was mostly receptive, but Dr. Harper's gaze remained fixed on Angela, his expression unreadable. Angela could feel the weight of his presence, but she didn't falter. She knew that this was her moment to prove herself, not just to the doctors, but to Dr. Harper as well. After the meeting, as the staff filtered out of the room, Angela gathered her things, ready to head back to the ward. Just as she reached for the door, Dr. Harper approached her. His expression was tense, but there was no trace of the condescension he had shown before. "Angela," he said, his tone surprisingly cordial. "I've been meaning to speak with you," Angela nodded, setting down the chart. "Of course, Doctor. What's on your mind?" Dr. Harper shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you before, in the operating room and, well, in general. I was wrong, and I realize that now." Angela's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this level of humility from Dr. Harper. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," she said finally. "It wasn't easy, but I appreciate you acknowledging that." Dr. Harper nodded, relief washing over his face. "You've done incredible work here, Angela. I've learned a lot from watching you, and I'm still learning." Angela smiled softly, grateful for the change in his demeanor. "We're all learning," she replied, "and as long as we keep focusing on the patients, we'll be okay." Dr. Harper smiled back, a weight seemingly lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a part of the team, rather than someone standing above it. After the conversation with Dr. Harper, Angela noticed that he had begun to make small but meaningful changes in his behavior. He no longer spoke to the nurses in a condescending tone, and he was more open to their suggestions during surgeries. The tension that had once defined the relationship between the doctors and nurses was slowly dissolving. The entire atmosphere of the surgical team felt lighter, more collaborative. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging surgery, Dr. Harper found himself in a familiar situation. An unexpected complication arose, and the patient's vitals began to drop. As the team moved quickly to address the problem, Angela, who had been monitoring the patient closely, stepped forward and offered a suggestion. This time, instead of dismissing her, Dr. Harper paused and listened. Without hesitation, Dr. Harper nodded, allowing Angela to take the lead in addressing the issue. The tension that had filled the room just moments before began to ease as Angela's solution quickly stabilized the patient. The surgical team moved with precision, following her guidance, and within minutes, the situation was under control. Dr. Harper glanced at Angela, a hint of surprise in his eyes. He had allowed her to take charge, and it had worked, better than he had expected. After the surgery, as the team cleaned up, one of the junior doctors approached Angela with a smile. "That was incredible," he said. "I've never seen Dr. Harper let someone else take the lead like that." Angela nodded, still processing the moment herself. It hadn't been about taking control. It had been about doing what was best for the patient. And for the first time, she realized that Dr. Harper might be starting to see that too. In the weeks that followed, there was a noticeable shift in the dynamic between Angela and Dr. Harper. While he wasn't outwardly supportive of the new initiative, his behavior in the operating room began to change. He listened more attentively when Angela offered suggestions, and though he was still firm in his decisions, there was a newfound respect in the way he spoke to her. The other staff members noticed the change as well. The tension that had once filled the room during surgeries was gradually being replaced by a sense of collaboration. Angela, for her part, remained humble. She didn't seek to challenge Dr. Harper's authority, but she did take advantage of the moments when her expertise could make a difference. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to come down, and a sense of mutual respect started to grow. Dr. Harper, though still grappling with his ego, couldn't deny that Angela's input had saved more than one patient's life in recent months. For the first time, he began to question whether the traditional hierarchy he had so fiercely defended was truly in the best interest of patient care. As the collaborative program continued to take shape, more and more doctors began to see the benefits of the changes. Those who had been skeptical of Angela's leadership at first were starting to come around. The number of incidents in the operating room dropped, and the communication between nurses and doctors improved significantly. Angela's calm, confident leadership became a model for others, and she was often invited to speak at departmental meetings to share her experiences. During one such meeting, a senior surgeon named Dr. Reynolds, who had been openly critical of the new program, stood up and addressed the room. "I'll admit, I wasn't on board with this idea when it was first introduced," he said, his voice carrying a tone of humility. "But after seeing the results firsthand, I can't argue with the impact it's had on patient outcomes. We're working better as a team, and that's what matters most." Angela felt a wave of pride wash over her as she listened. It was clear that the hospital was changing for the better, and she had played a pivotal role in that transformation. Several months after the collaborative program was launched, the hospital held its annual awards ceremony to recognize outstanding contributions to patient care. The event was a formal affair, attended by doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators alike. Angela, who had never been one for the spotlight, attended the event out of respect for her colleagues, but didn't expect any personal recognition. She had simply been doing her job, nothing more, nothing less. As the night went on, various awards were handed out to staff members who had gone above and beyond in their duties. Toward the end of the ceremony, Mr. Maxwell took to the stage. "Tonight, we're recognizing someone who has not only saved lives, but has changed the way we approach patient care at this hospital," he began. "This person's leadership and commitment to collaboration have improved outcomes and strengthened the bond between nurses and doctors." Angela shifted uncomfortably in her seat, not realizing that Mr. Maxwell was about to call her name. "It is my great honor to present the year's Excellence in Leadership Award to Nurse Angela Wilson." The room erupted in applause as Angela's name was called. She blinked in disbelief, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stood and made her way to the stage, she saw Dr. Harper clapping along with the rest of the crowd, a genuine smile on his face. For the first time, Angela felt the full weight of what she had accomplished, and it was overwhelming. As Angela stepped onto the stage, the applause rang in her ears, but her focus was on Mr. Maxwell, who stood smiling as he handed her the award. Angela took a deep breath and looked out into the sea of faces, her colleagues, the doctors, and especially Dr. Harper, who was still clapping with a nod of acknowledgement. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, and a part of her wanted to disappear back into the crowd. But she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about the work she and the other nurses had done to change the hospital's culture. Angela took the microphone, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves. This recognition means a lot to me. But this isn't about one person. The changes we've made couldn't have happened without the hard work and dedication of everyone in this room. This award belongs to all of us. Every nurse, every doctor, every staff member who has worked to make patient care our top priority. The room fell quiet, and she could feel the weight of her words sinking in. She paused for a moment, glancing at Dr. Harper, who met her gaze with a look of quiet respect. Together we can continue to improve, to learn from each other, and to make this hospital the best it can be. Thank you again. The crowd erupted in applause as Angela stepped back, her heart swelling with a sense of pride and purpose. Later that evening, after the ceremony had ended and the crowd began to disperse, Dr. Harper found himself lingering behind. He had been moved by Angela's speech, but more than that, he was struck by how much she had accomplished in such a short time. As he watched her speaking with her fellow nurses and a few doctors, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for the way he had treated her in the past. The man who had once prided himself on being the unquestioned authority in the operating room was beginning to realize that his way of thinking had been wrong. Dr. Harper approached the exit, ready to head home when Mr. Maxwell stopped him. "Richard," he called out, walking over with a thoughtful expression. "That was quite an evening, wasn't it?" Dr. Harper nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "It was," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. Mr. Maxwell studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I wanted to thank you for being open to the changes we've implemented. I know it hasn't been easy for you, but I've seen the way you've adapted, and I respect that." Dr. Harper blinked, surprised by the praise. "I'm just trying to do what's best for the hospital," he said simply. Mr. Maxwell smiled. "We all are, Richard. That's what makes this place work." A few days after the ceremony, Angela was working in the ward, organizing patient charts and preparing for a busy shift. She hadn't had much time to think about the award since that night. There were patients to care for, surgeries to prepare for, and 100 other things to focus on. But the mood in the hospital had shifted. People seemed to treat her with even more respect, and nurses from other departments came to her for advice on handling difficult situations. Angela was happy to help, but she remained humble, knowing that the work was far from over. As she finished updating the charts, Angela heard someone clear their throat behind her. She turned and was surprised to see Dr. Harper standing there, looking more relaxed than usual. "Angela," he said, his tone surprisingly cordial. "I've been meaning to speak with you." Angela nodded, setting down the chart. "Of course, doctor. What's on your mind?" Dr. Harper shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. "I wanted to apologize for how I treated you before, in the operating room, and, well, in general. I was wrong, and I realize that now." Angela's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this level of humility from Dr. Harper. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. "Thank you," she said finally. "It wasn't easy, but I appreciate you acknowledging that." Dr. Harper nodded, relief washing over his face. "You've done incredible work here, Angela. I've learned a lot from watching you, and I'm still learning." Angela smiled softly, grateful for the change in his demeanor. "We're all learning," she replied, "and as long as we keep focusing on the patients, we'll be okay." Dr. Harper smiled back, a weight seemingly lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he felt like a part of the team, rather than someone standing above it. After the conversation with Dr. Harper, Angela noticed that he had begun to make small but meaningful changes in his behavior. He no longer spoke to the nurses in a condescending tone, and he was more open to their suggestions during surgeries. The tension that had once defined the relationship between the doctors and nurses was slowly dissolving. The entire atmosphere of the surgical team felt lighter, more collaborative. One afternoon, during a particularly challenging surgery, Dr. Harper found himself in a familiar situation. An unexpected complication arose, and the patient's vitals began to drop. As the team moved quickly to address the problem, Angela, who had been monitoring the patient closely, stepped forward and offered a suggestion. This time, instead of dismissing her, Dr. Harper paused and listened. Without hesitation, Dr. Harper nodded, allowing Angela to take the lead in addressing the issue. The tension that had filled the room just moments before began to ease, as Angela's solution quickly stabilized the patient. The surgical team moved with precision, following her guidance, and within minutes, the situation was under control. Dr. Harper glanced at Angela, a hint of surprise in his eyes. He had allowed her to take charge, and it had worked better than he had expected. After the surgery, as the team cleaned up, one of the junior doctors approached Angela with a smile. "That was incredible," he said. "I've never seen Dr. Harper let someone else take the lead like that." Angela nodded, still processing the moment herself. It hadn't been about taking control. It had been about doing what was best for the patient. And for the first time, she realized that Dr. Harper might be starting to see that too. In the weeks that followed, there was a noticeable shift in the dynamic between Angela and Dr. Harper. While he wasn't outwardly supportive of the new initiative, his behavior in the operating room began to change. He listened more attentively when Angela offered suggestions, and though he was still firm in his decisions, there was a newfound respect in the way he spoke to her. The other staff members noticed the change as well. The tension that had once filled the room during surgeries was gradually being replaced by a sense of collaboration. Angela, for her part, remained humble. She didn't seek to challenge Dr. Harper's authority, but she did take advantage of the moments when her expertise could make a difference. Slowly but surely, the walls between them began to come down, and a sense of mutual respect started to grow. Dr. Harper, though still grappling with his ego, couldn't deny that Angela's input had saved more than one patient's life in recent months. For the first time, he began to question whether the traditional hierarchy he had so fiercely defended was truly in the best interest of patient care. As the collaborative program continued to take shape, more and more doctors began to see the benefits of the changes. Those who had been skeptical of Angela's leadership at first were starting to come around. The number of incidents in the operating room dropped, and the communication between nurses and doctors improved significantly. Angela's calm, confident leadership became a model for others, and she was often invited to speak at departmental meetings to share her experiences. During one such meeting, a senior surgeon named Dr. Reynolds, who had been openly critical of the new program, stood up and addressed the room. "I'll admit, I wasn't on board with this idea when it was first introduced," he said, his voice carrying a tone of humility. "But after seeing the results firsthand, I can't argue with the impact it's had on patient outcomes. We're working better as a team, and that's what matters most." Angela felt a wave of pride wash over her as she listened. It was clear that the hospital was changing for the better, and she had played a pivotal role in that transformation. Several months after the collaborative program was launched, the hospital held its annual awards ceremony to recognize outstanding contributions to patient care. The event was a formal affair, attended by doctors, nurses, and hospital administrators alike. Angela, who had never been one for the spotlight, attended the event out of respect for her colleagues, but didn't expect any personal recognition. She had simply been doing her job, nothing more, nothing less. As the night went on, various awards were handed out to staff members who had gone above and beyond in their duties. Toward the end of the ceremony, Mr. Maxwell took to the stage. "Tonight, we're recognizing someone who has not only saved lives, but has changed the way we approach patient care at this hospital," he began. "This person's leadership and commitment to collaboration have improved outcomes and strengthened the bond between nurses and doctors." Angela shifted uncomfortably in her seat, not realizing that Mr. Maxwell was about to call her name. "It is my great honor to present this year's Excellence in Leadership Award to Nurse Angela Wilson." The room erupted in applause as Angela's name was called. She blinked in disbelief, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stood and made her way to the stage, she saw Dr. Harper clapping along with the rest of the crowd, a genuine smile on his face. For the first time, Angela felt the full weight of what she had accomplished, and it was overwhelming. Thank you so much for watching this incredible story of resilience, humility, and transformation. If you enjoyed it, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. We've got plenty more to come, and you won't want to miss them.